Okay, so Kelsey McLaughlin with a bachelor's in forest health from SUNY ESF. She's a forest pathologist with the DEC Forest Health Research Lab, and she's currently working on beech leaf disease, oak wilt pine needle, sorry, I can't read my rating, white pine needle damage, and other pathogens reported by the public. So before that, she was a forestry technician in the state's oak wilt management program for 3 years and coordinated statewide surveys, management, and outreach. So with that, I'll let you share your screen and take it from here, Kelsey.
Hopefully you can see that, and then we're gonna hit that. Does everything look good?
Yep.
Perfect. All right, so thanks for that introduction, Sarah. Yeah, I'm Kelsey. I work at the DEC's Forest Health Research Lab, and today we're going to talk about monitoring tree health for the early detection of forest health issues. So it's kind of 3 little mini presentations put into one. So the first thing we're going to talk about is things homeowners can look for in their trees and signs of tree stress. And then we're going to talk about what the DEC does to look for tree health issues on a broad scale all across the state. And then we're going to end with focusing on a few forest health issues that are really relevant in the capital region. So I'm going to make that smaller. There we go. So what is tree health? We'll start with a really basic question. Well, we define tree health as the capacity of a tree to resist stress and provide ecological or human services. So basically, we want it to be able to bounce back from issues and continue to do all the great things that we love trees for. And these stresses are both biotic and abiotic factors. So there's things like insects that bore into the trunk of the tree, or fungi that are on the leaves, or caterpillars that are eating the leaves. And those are all biotic factors. Those are all living things. But there's also abiotic factors, like trees that are growing in a small area, in an urban area, that don't have a ton of room for their roots, or trees that are damaged by storms. So a resilient tree is able to bounce back from all these things and continue living and providing services. So when you're diagnosing a tree problem, though, it's almost never just one thing. So there's what we call both primary and secondary issues. And so primary issues are tree killers. These are things that once they're in a tree, the tree is on the way out. So things like wood-boring insects, for example. Secondary issues are things that set the tree up for failure. These are big stresses that weaken the tree over time. So something like a big wound to the base like this, or something like drought, for example. And Paul Mannion from ESF, he kind of put this together in the format that I like the best. This is his thing on the right, the decline disease spiral. And I'm going to see if I can get a laser pointer here. There we go. And so the secondary factors are in kind of these outer 2 rings, the predisposing and inciting. And these are the things that set the tree up for stress. So something like low soil moisture holding capacity, for example. When you couple that with something like drought, that really stresses the tree and weakens it. And then something like a wood or bark boring insect can come in and really be the nail in the coffin that finishes off that tree. So there's a few different symptoms of poor health that you can look out for. Color changes in the crown or in the leaves are a big one. So this is beech leaf disease that we were just talking about. Those stripes are not a horticultural variety or anything like that. That's a sign of stress. That's a sign of damage. So seeing those color changes are a sign that your tree is not as healthy as it should be. Early leaf loss is also a symptom of poor health. So these are pictures of oak wilt. That's another tree disease we can talk about. And in this picture, you can see this tree is, 90% defoliated, and all the trees around it are still nice and green and healthy. So that's a sign that something is seriously wrong. And then we talk a lot about dieback in forest health, and dieback is kind of the progressive death of the shoots. So trees like to keep their leaves kind of way out at the tips of their canopy on these little twigs, right? And dieback is kind of the loss of those little twigs over time. And so what you get is the crown kind of shrinking into itself and getting really, really small and closer to the center of the tree. And then sometimes the tree can also put out these shoots. This is what's called an epicormic shoot. And these are just little tufts of twigs and leaves that come straight out of the trunk of the tree. And this is a sign that something has been very, very stressful. The tree has had a very bad time for a very long time. So those are a symptom of a pretty serious stress. Some more symptoms of poor health, damage by insects. So this picture on the right is southern pine beetle. That's a invasive insect we deal with on Long Island a lot. And whenever they bore into the tree, they make these little resin pockets that exude out behind them. And then obviously, if something's eating your tree's leaves, the tree doesn't love that. So whenever you're thinking about insect damage, I always try to, put it in proportion. One caterpillar munching on one leaf is not significantly stressing the tree. But if you have something that's eating 50% of your leaves, that's a lot more stressful. Cankers, rots, and decay. If you can see into your tree, that's a sign of poor health in your tree. So something like this where you can see that rot in the center, that's a symptom of poor health, and that's going to be a stress that tree has to deal with. Cankers are a symptom where the tissue underneath the bark is killed by a fungus. And so it usually shows up as these discolored areas on the bark. And then if you notice, everything above this discolored area is dead. So the canker has kind of killed all that conductive tissue and just cut off this part of the tree. And then wilting after leaf out. So whenever your tree first leaves out in the spring, it put a lot of work into those nice new leaves. And so if you go back a month later and all those new leaves are gone, that's obviously a big stress for that tree. So this is at the Indian Kill Preserve in Glenville. And so we can see this tree was very wilted and very brown, and this oak right across the trail was nice and big and green. I actually was taking these pictures because I was concerned about oak wilt, but what it ended up being was this tree on the right had actually been flooded for about a year. So it was just the water stress essentially that killed it. Other threats to tree health, tree age. Trees are like people. As they get older, they're less resilient to stresses. They don't bounce back as well. I often joke that people think trees are like rocks and they should just never change and they should never get old and they should never die. But unfortunately, that's not how it works. So as your trees get older, you'll see they won't bounce back as well and they can be more likely to decline. Bad pruning practices. Anytime you prune, you're making a wound on a tree. And anytime you make a wound on a tree, there's a chance for fungi and other issues to get in. So if you're pruning, just make sure you're doing it right to kind of minimize that damage. Bad mulching practices are also a big issue. This picture in the upper right here is what we jokingly call weed whacker disease. And this is something we see a lot, unfortunately. And we joke that it's one of the most curable diseases because all you have to do is put down some mulch and you wouldn't feel the need to weed whack around your tree. And this can really damage the tree and it'll usually kill kind of the top portion. Everything above this gets cut off essentially by this repeated wounding at the base. Poor sites and poor soils for planting. Obviously planting a tree smack against your house is not great for the tree. It's also probably not ideal for your house. So just making sure that trees are in the right place is really important. And then the last one is failure to monitor. We're all busy people. I get it. We can't all look at trees all day. But I have many, many calls that are like this. That my tree just died suddenly and I can look at this and say, okay, well, that tree doesn't have any bark and that tree doesn't have any fine branches. And so that tree probably died about 3 years ago. So being able to monitor your trees kind of sets both you and the tree up for success, because not only can you see something's going wrong before you suddenly have a tree that's dead in your yard, but you can also have the opportunity to take corrective action and keep that tree around for longer. The environment is a big part of tree stress. Trees can't get up and move away from a bad environment. So knowing what the environment is like around your tree can help you recognize what may threaten its health. If you're in really, really sandy soils like I am, and there's a drought like there was this fall, that's going to be more damaging than a tree that's maybe in more water retaining soils. So if there is a drought in your area and you have the ability to supplementally water, this can reduce tree stress. That's really important with trees that have had a big stress event in the past. So for example, if there's trees that have been defoliated by spongy moth and then they get hit by drought, those are the ones that really start declining. If your tree has wet feet for part of the year, this can manifest as symptoms throughout the year. So if you have the opposite problem, you have a really wet soil, you have flooding issues, that can also manifest as different issues. And this tree on the right was actually a tree that we were called to look at. The homeowner was concerned about oak wilt. And then once we got there, she told us the water line had broke. And for about 2 weeks, there was just water pooling around this tree. So it ended up being flooding damage and not oak wilt. So kind of the golden question is, how much stress is too much, right? That's what we all want to know. And it depends. It depends on the pre-existing stressors that tree has faced. It depends on when the stress occurs. Trees have an easier time bouncing back from stresses later in the season because they've already gathered the sugars they need for the year. And it also depends on the tree species. So if you're facing something like defoliating insects, like the big spongy moth outbreak that we had a few years ago, ask yourself if your tree is used to regrowing leaves, a deciduous tree, or if it's not, a conifer. And with deciduous trees in general, 1 or even 2 years of defoliation are not usually cause for concern as long as the tree was healthy beforehand and it continues to appear healthy, for a year or two afterwards. That said, you still have to watch out for those symptoms of poor health we discussed earlier. If you start seeing those apicormic shoots, the tree is on the way out, unfortunately. And again, anything you can do to mitigate stress will improve tree health. So monitoring your trees. Again, I know we're all busy people, but even just knowing what tree species you have and knowing what their preferred growing conditions are can go a long way towards mitigating stress. This picture on the right was a blue spruce that we were called to look at in Waterford. And blue spruce is a sun-loving tree. It would be happiest in the middle of a field with nobody else around for miles. But instead, what we see is it was up against this wood line. There were branches that were reaching over this tree. And then what you can't see in this picture is that the house was actually 40 feet, kind of this way. And so this tree maybe only got sun for 3 hours a day. And so that's not what a tree like this wants. It was really struggling, and that's what set it up for damage by these wood-boring insects that you can kind of see the damage from here. If you can only monitor your tree once a year, do it in the spring. If you check it in the spring, you can see how well it's leafing out. So you can see whether it appears healthy and vigorous, or you can see that things are off color or smaller than they should be, or, well, there's some dieback that wasn't there last year. So those are things to kind of watch out for and keep in the back of your mind moving forward. And then if there is a big stress event, like that spongy moth defoliation or a flood or a drought or something like that, check your trees again. And kind of try to keep checking them as much as you can, because it can take a while for stress to kind of manifest in trees. They're long-lived, kind of slow-growing things, and so they may not show signs of stress for years after a major stress event. Mitigate stress where you can, especially human stresses. Again, just throwing down some mulch, preventing that weed whacker disease, preventing, compaction where you can, avoiding, trampling the roots or moving soil around the roots of your trees. These are all things that are going to help your tree remain healthy longer. And then if you do notice that something's going wrong, take photos and know who to talk to. Unfortunately, this time of year, I get calls. I had one a couple weeks ago that said, my tree seemed really sick this year and I don't know why. And they didn't have any pictures. So I said, I don't know why either. We'll try again in the spring. But just having some kind of documentation can really help whenever you're trying to figure out what's been happening with your tree. So if you don't know who to talk to, you can talk to me or folks in my lab by emailing this foresthealth@dec.ny.gov. You're going to see that email address a lot in this presentation, so hopefully you'll have it memorized by the end. And then I also put some links for our lab, and then a link for the Caring for Urban Trees webpage that we have. That web page has really good information on how to mulch properly. It has information on how to prune properly, and then it also has information on how to find an arborist. And then some arborist information. There's ISA certified arborist at treesaregood.org. This one actually has where you can put in your zip code and it pops out a list of arborists. So that's really useful if you do need help with tree work. And then the Tree Care Industry Association also has a website that has information on how to contact their arborists. All right, so that's kind of the first section. Does anybody have any questions on general tree stress, general tree health, anything like that? And I can't see the chat, so Sarah, if you see any in there.
Yeah, I don't see a question yet.
Okay. All right, well, hearing none, we can just keep cruising and I'll see if there are any by the time we get through the next section here. All right, so now we're going to talk about how the DEC monitors tons and tons of trees at this massive statewide scale, right? And this is me doing one of my all-time favorite things to do. I'm in a helicopter and we're flying around looking at trees, and the thing I have in my hands is essentially an iPad. And I can sketch the location of sick-looking trees and send it to people on the ground. And so that's what we call our aerial survey. And aerial survey is one of our really, really good ways to get eyes on just massive, massive amounts of trees. So we typically try to do statewide flights, just general forest health flights. And then we have a couple of programs that fly sort of specific targeted areas. So for example, this map on the right here is our oak wilt flight lines around Canandaigua Lake. So these lines are about half a mile apart, and the idea is the helicopter just goes back and forth along all these lines, and I mark any sick-looking oak trees, like this guy, for example. This tree, whenever I saw it, was kind of an oh no moment because it has all the right signs. So it has kind of a mix of brown and green leaves. There was some dead material over here next to it, so that might be another dead oak next to it. It looked a little thin. I could tell it started dropping some leaves. And again, you can just see that all the trees around it look totally green, totally normal. Everything's fine. It's just this oak. And so we landed the helicopter. And I think I went the next day, or no, I went the same day. I went the same day because I had to know whether this was oak wilt. And it turns out it was. We also do quite a lot of ground surveys. So this here on the left is what it might look like whenever a person on the ground is trying to follow up on a flight. So this was some oak discoloration that somebody flew over in the Adirondacks that gets sent to somebody's phone. You can use your phone to navigate right to it and then fill in information on those trees. We also do just a ton of ground surveys where people drive around looking for specific forest types and then looking for specific issues in those forest types. So this map is our beech leaf disease surveys. And since 2020, we've surveyed over 117,000 beech. We surveyed 27,000 just last year. And we aim for 2 surveys per county per year. If it's a county where we don't think we have beech leaf disease, we usually bump that up to 4. So there's a ton of interns that are putting in a lot of time and a lot of miles and looking at literally hundreds of thousands of trees just to try and identify these diseases. Our interns also do campground surveys because we know that a lot of these pests and diseases move on firewood and can come through campgrounds where people are coming from far away. We also do a few different trapping programs. I just want to talk about the one today. This is our early detection and rapid response trapping. And the idea behind these trapping programs, this is what's called a Lindgren funnel trap. And if you imagine that you're a beetle, if you're a beetle, this looks like a tree to you. Just trust me. And it also smells really good because we put lures in there that smell like their pheromones or tree stress chemicals or things that they like to eat. And so you're a beetle, this looks like a tree, it smells like a great place to hang out, and they will fly and try to land on these funnels, but they're slippery plastic. And so they fall through the funnel into the next funnel, all the way down to the collection cup here at the bottom that has some antifreeze in it. And that antifreeze just keeps them from flying back out and then also helps preserve them. And so this trapping program, we're looking for non-native bark and ambrosia beetles. And so that's some of these guys over here on the right. And you think they look super cool and funky, but if you just saw them out in the wild, you'd probably just think they were a piece of bark or something really small. They're smaller than a grain of rice usually, so they don't look this cool until you can get them underneath a microscope. But these are beetles that can cause a lot of damage to trees. These are beetles that tend to bore into the trunk and feed on the cambium. And so they can do a lot of damage very quickly. We're really concerned about non-native ones of these coming over in, solid wood packing material or other wood products. And so this is one that we do every single year. This is actually a national program, so a lot of states do it. But New York is one of the only ones in the Northeast that does it every single year. And we usually shoot for around 12 sites. We have also started looking for different types of DNA work. This is kind of the forest health of the future. Like this was just kind of getting started whenever I was in college, and it's just really taken off and been really cool to see kind of bloom since I've started in the field. So I'm going to talk about a few different DNA methods here, but the first is what's called eDNA or environmental DNA. And eDNA is kind of just the idea that if you're a creature living in the world, you are shedding cells that have your DNA. And so this was first used in aquatic systems because if you're a fish living in a stream, you're shedding cells that have your DNA. And some ambitious researcher can scoop up a vial of that water and distill your DNA out of that water and identify it. So that's really great if you live in water. But for things like forest health issues that are on land, we had to kind of pioneer ways to get that DNA and collect that DNA. So this was a multi-agency effort. Rutgers did a lot of the work on this. And what they found was you could get that DNA a couple different ways. So on the left here, they're spraying down these leaves with water. and then just collecting that water in a funnel. So kind of artificially making that stream. And then the picture on the right here is Maria is actually using a paint roller that's been wet with water. And then you can actually take the material off that paint roller, spray it down, and collect the DNA from that. And so they've done this to detect spotted lanternfly, and they've also done it to detect emerald ash borer in these terrestrial ecosystems. Some more DNA work. This was a paper we put out a few years ago. I was spending 20 plus hours in a helicopter every single year looking for these single oak wilt infected trees on the landscape. And I joke that it was just, I was getting jealous of the entomologist in my lab, the people who study bugs, because you guys have it so easy. You just put out a trap with some pheromones and everything you're interested in comes to you. You don't have to fly around and try to find it like I do. And so we kind of collectively, you know, Jess and Rob, Cole and Liam came up with this idea of, well, if we could trap the beetles that carry the oak wilt fungus, could we then use those beetles to see if those beetles have oak wilt DNA on them? And so these are the beetles that move the oak wilt fungus. They're pretty cute, but they're also pretty small. But we were trapping them pretty regularly across the state, and we worked with Karen Snoverclift at Cornell. She was the mastermind who figured out how to get the DNA off them and amplify it. And what we found was we could pick up nidodulid beetles with this oak wilt DNA in areas where we didn't even know we had the disease. So these red circles are infected trees that we found and managed. And then all of these stars are places that we trapped these beetles that had the oak wilt DNA on them. So it's kind of an early warning system, essentially, is what we're trying to use it for. We're using it to direct surveys. We've started doing some more surveys. Here in Steuben County, for example, we fly over all these oak stands where we've had beetles detected, just to see if that kind of points us in the right direction to find those infected trees. And then some more DNA stuff. So whenever we put out one of those traps on the landscape, right? If we're trapping for, let's say, southern pine beetle using one of those Lindgren funnel traps. Southern pine beetle is not the only thing that comes to those traps. You get a lot of other stuff. You get a lot of other beetles, you get moths, you get wasps, you get all kinds of stuff. And so we call that stuff bycatch. It's just off-target insects that we've trapped. And we started to have this bycatch kind of piling up in our freezers because we didn't have the, you know, the manpower, the knowledge, the time to kind of sift through these thousands and thousands of insects across all these different orders and identify them all. And so this was a project, we've been through a few different iterations of it with a few different labs. But essentially what we wanted to know was, can we take this bycatch and extract DNA from this bycatch and then use that DNA to identify the insects that are in it? So for example, in this one, they placed the insects in what they called a tea, and they kind of just let the insects steep in there and then used that liquid and amplified that DNA, and then did what's called barcoding to match that DNA to specific species. And I don't expect you to know what all these guys are over here on the left. I don't know what all these guys are. You'd have to ask the entomologist in my lab. But essentially, this was just kind of a control that we did where we had known insect species, and we wanted to see if they were detected with this method. And you can see that not everything was detected. We had about a 30% success rate with this method. And you're like, wow, 30% seems kind of low. But you have to remember that that's still 30% that we didn't have before. It would have just been sitting in our freezer unidentified anyway. So like I said, we've been through a few different iterations of this. We're currently working with Cornell to kind of optimize this process and see if we can kind of raise that number a little bit higher. We're also doing kind of similar work with fungi because certain fungi are moved around by insects, like those nididulid beetles I mentioned earlier and oak wilt. So we want to see if we can also barcode the fungal DNA that's in these samples to look for any new potential pathogens as a kind of early detection system for those as well. We can also use the dendrochronological record, which is a really long name to say we can look at tree growth patterns to kind of identify when forest health issues have emerged. And this is work that every time I get a chance to do it, it seems so cool. I wish we could do it more. But essentially what you're doing is you take a core, which is just a very, very small slice of the trunk of a tree. And you can look at the growth rings of that tree and plot how wide they are. So this is the width, and I think millimeters, they're not very big. And then you can kind of relate the good growth years to good things and the bad growth years to bad things, essentially. So we can identify things like droughts all the way back to the 1930s or spongy moth outbreaks. And so we can do this to identify, kind of big decline events. So this was a core I took for an oak decline project, where you can see here in 2015 and 2016, it was both spongy moth and drought that really knocked down this tree, and this tree was actually dead whenever I cored it. But you can see that's the lowest growth it's had since the 70s. So we can do it for very specific things where we kind of know or suspect that something is happening. But we can also do it to kind of go back and see when something emerged. So this has been done for emerald ash borer. We did it for white pine needle damage. They're working on it now for beech leaf disease. But essentially, if you take a bunch of cores from a bunch of hosts, if you take a course from white pine all across the state, and you determine when their growth started declining, you can kind of determine when those big issues kind of came into play. So for example, with white pine needle damage, we believe it might have shown up as early as 2012, even though we didn't really start getting reports until 2016. You can also kind of bring the bugs to you. And that's the idea of this urban rearing project. This was started by the Forest Service at Greenwood Cemetery, which is one of the green spaces in Brooklyn. And the idea was, Greenwood Cemetery is an arboretum. It has a lot of non-native tree species. And it's also at this big port of entry, right, where all these, potential invasive species are coming in. And so what they did was whenever they pruned those non-native tree species, they took all the branches and put them in one of these barrels. And then the wood-boring beetles that live in those branches would kind of complete their life cycle and come out into these little cups that Erica's holding up here. And whenever they did this in Brooklyn, they actually found a Grylus species that was new to science. It had never been described before, and so it was found for the first time in Greenwood in these non-native tree materials. We have like a little baby version of this. We work with the City of Albany forester, and he gives us tree material, but we do have our own little barrel set up. So far, we haven't gotten anything super crazy, but we have had some kind of rare native beetles emerge, which has also been cool to see. And then the last thing I'll talk about is public reporting. Public reporting is huge for monitoring forest health across the state. I think I'm pretty good at my job, but I can't be everywhere at once. And public reporting has led to some really huge wins for invasive species. So it led to the detection of hemlock woolly adelgid on Turtle Island in Lake George. That was actually, there were DEC surveyors that were on a boat going from island to island in Lake George looking for hemlock woolly adelgid. And there was a lady camping on the island, and they stopped to talk to her and said, this is kind of what we're looking for. And as they were getting ready to leave, she came running up, waving a branch and said, wait, I have it. I have what you're looking for. I found it. And that was the first time that we'd found hemlock woolly adelgid on Turtle Island. The first detection of elm zigzag sawfly in Canada was from an iNaturalist report. Again, just a member of the public taking a picture of a weird elm leaf that they saw, and it led to the first detection of an insect in a completely new continent. It had never been detected here before. I've honestly lost count of the number of new beech leaf disease county confirmations that have come from the public. It's a really recognizable disease and people are really interested in looking for it, which is great. So the public has helped us out hugely with that disease. And then also the first detection of oak wilt in New York State was from the public. In 2008, it was just a woman who, I believe it was a woman who noticed a sick oak in her yard and called it in. And so they went and tested it and found out it was oak wilt, and the nearest known infection of oak wilt was 165 miles away. So we would have never known that disease was there if that person hadn't called it in. And even since then, the detection of 43% of our oak wilt infected trees that we've found and managed has been due to public reports. So in that program, we continue to really value public reporting. It's really crucial in helping us find these single infected trees on the landscape. So yeah, public reports make a difference for sure. If you're interested in reporting, I have a few links here on the side. This is IMAP invasives. So if you want to report invasive species, that's kind of the big database to do it. You can make an account, it's free, but you also don't have to make an account if you don't want another account to keep track of. They have just a kind of basic reporting form that you don't need an account for now. So you can report, you can report beech leaf disease, you can report oak wilt, you can report spotted lanternfly, all different invasive species in New York State. Again, here's foresthealth@dec.ny.gov if you want to talk to me. If you think trees look sick and you don't know why, that's a good place to start. And then the Capital Region is part of the Capital Region PRISM, or Partnership for Regional Invasive Species Management. These guys are awesome. They do surveys, they do management, they do volunteer events and outreach. So if you're interested in doing more with invasive species, they're also a great place to start. All right, and that's the end of the big statewide monitoring section. So do we have any questions on any of that?
We do, and I can read these, and also the people that wrote them can unmute themselves to further ask, if that's okay.
Totally.
So in the chat, I guess you can't see the chat section, right, Kelsey?
Yeah, no.
Okay, so Matt, and also Matt, and if you want to unmute yourself, it's fine. He asks for emerald ash borer. Can you look at the D-shaped hole in the bark, or is that more of a latter stage infestation?
So yeah, emerald ash borer will make those D-shaped holes no matter what stage of infestation it is. I believe, I'm not an entomologist, I'm a pathologist, but I believe that typically the earlier infestations are usually up in the branches, so it may just be harder to see. You don't really get those really recognizable eye level D-shaped exit holes until later, I think. But that's kind of my impression. But
Okay.
yes, they're always D-shaped no matter what stage of the infection it is.
Okay, good to know. And then Matt also asked, can you guesstimate tree stressor periods by the length and branching whorls around the tree trunk, smaller gaps indicating less growth per year, in white pines at least?
So I think you can. Yeah, for white pine in particular and pine species, they do those whorls of branches every year. Deciduous trees, they're a lot more, and spruces and other things, they're a lot more just kind of limbs all over the place. But yeah, if you can kind of see the different sizes of those whorls, you can get a sense of how well the tree was growing or not growing. The other thing that you can do is actually, if you can access the twigs, you can see how well that twig was growing just by looking at the length of what's called the node. So you'll see a little kind of circle of scars on the twig and then another little circle of scars on the twig. And that's how much that twig grew in a single year. So that can also kind of be used to estimate growth, especially on those smaller trees.
Okay. And then could you go over the symptoms of beech leaf disease and oak wilt?
Absolutely. That's the next section.
Oh, good. Okay. I remember seeing some good questions from Tom, but I don't see them now. Maybe you answered them. Maybe he deleted after you answered.
Oh,
Okay.
cool. All right. Well, keep throwing them in there and I'll keep answering them, but we'll keep moving right along to forest pest and pathogen highlights. And I think the first two we're going to do are oak wilt and beech leaf disease. Yep, here we are. So oak wilt is a fungal pathogen. It's a fungus disease of oaks. All species of oaks can be affected, but red oaks, these ones with the pointy leaf tips, are the ones that kind of get it the worst. They're the ones that show symptoms very quickly and die very quickly, whereas the white oaks, it's a much slower disease progression. They'll just lose a couple of branches a year. The red oaks, they look like this the same summer that they're infected. So it's a very, very rapid tree death in the same season as infection. And so we know we have oak wilt in kind of 3 areas of New York State. So Glenville is where it was first detected. The most recent detection in Glenville was in 2018. In Canandaigua, it was detected in 2016 and has been most recently detected in 2023. And then on Long Island, it was detected in 2016, and we have not found it on Long Island since. But those are kind of the 3 areas that we think of the most whenever we're talking about oak wilt. And as far as symptoms, one of the big symptoms is that you're going to have this really sudden leaf drop in July, August, sometimes into September. And you'll have a red oak lose, upwards of 80% of its leaves in a very, very short time frame. I've had people who went away for vacation for 2 weeks and came back and their tree was 90% defoliated. And they're like, what happened? That's oak wilt. It's very, very sudden and very, very severe in these red oaks. So because it drops so many leaves, typically what I'll do, especially if I'm in like a forested setting trying to find it, I kind of almost follow these like a breadcrumb trail back to the mother tree, as it were. I usually find these symptomatic leaves before I find the tree itself. And the symptoms on the leaves, they can vary. The most kind of picturesque description is that it looks like the leaf was dipped in brown paint. So you'll see it's brown at this tip, and then it's green back towards the leaf stem. It's not spotty, it's a very uniform discoloration, but it doesn't always look like that. And so we try to stress, if your tree is dropping, your oak is dropping a ton of leaves in July and August, we want to hear about it either way, even if it doesn't look exactly like this picturesque oak wilt leaf. The other thing you'll notice with oak wilt is there's kind of a mix of brown and green leaves in the canopy, right? I talked about that during the aerial survey. And you can see that in these photos as well. This is actually a video, if I can get it to play. Oh, maybe not. That's unfortunate. Oh, there we go. All right, and then
Good news is your view's gonna get enhanced.
so that's an oak wilt tree. And
Sharp turn of driveway.
sorry for Bryce speaking there. But this is an oak wilt, again, that kind of picturesque leaf looking like it's been dipped in brown paint from the tip and that nice green back towards the base. So that's what it looks like in real time. Not a lot of leaves, mix of brown and green. The leaves don't really like shrivel up or kind of collapse too much. They're usually pretty flat, and they usually still have some amount of green on them. And with oak wilt, one of the big risks is wounds. That's how this disease most commonly gets into trees. Those nididulid beetles I talked about have the fungus spores on them, and they can find a wound in as little as 10 minutes. They're very, very good at what they do. They really, really like the sap from the trees. And so if a tree is wounded during kind of the high risk time, from April to July, when those beetles are flying and the fungus is sporulating, we don't recommend pruning. And if trees do get wounded, wounds happen, just try to immediately cover them with paint. And so up here are some examples of wounds on different trees. This was actually a guy in the Finger Lakes who hired a person with a forestry mower to come in. He was just mowing brush underneath all these trees essentially. And the cab of the mower smacked into the branch and made a nice wound. He had oak wilt. And then this one is, these trees were actually spiked by a tree care person. And this is not something that arborists usually do anymore, just because it creates so many wounds on the tree. But each of these little dots essentially is a spike hole. And these trees were also infected with oak wilt. And then the other way that we think that oak wilt gets around is on firewood. Whenever oak wilt was found, it was 165 miles from the nearest known infection. We don't think nididulid beetles fly that far. So it was probably firewood movement that got this disease into New York State. And so if you're in the town of Glenville, it's actually a quarantine zone for oak wilt. And so firewood movement is not permitted during this high risk time. And then the rest of the time, if you want to move firewood, it requires a DEC permit, just so our foresters can look and say, okay, there's nothing that seems like, nothing that seems like you'd be transporting oak wilt here. It's not a super complicated permit process. I don't think we've ever denied a permit. It's just something that helps us make sure that we know where this material is going. But yeah, if you do need to prune, January is a great time. The beetles are not flying, the fungus is not sporulating. So try and get your pruning done over the winter if you can. Okay, I threw my other oak issue in before beech leaf disease, but we'll get there, I promise. So this is also something that should be very, very familiar to a lot of you, I'm sure. Spongy moth. So it's been popping up around the state since I believe about 2020 it started in the Finger Lakes, maybe 2021. And it started in the Finger Lakes, and then it had a year where it was like way up north in Clinton County. And then it had a year where it smacked the capital region. And now it's mostly in the lower Hudson at this point. They've had about 600,000 acres of defoliation down there. And so this is what it looks like, for a few weeks during the summer. People were complaining that it looked like wintertime. All the trees had no leaves. Oh my gosh, what's happening? And then, a month later, the trees leached back out and everybody was like, oh, thank gosh, everything's fine. But whenever we started doing our oak wilt surveys in the next subsequent years, we started picking up these oaks that were totally orange, these oaks that were totally dead. And we recognized that we had essentially an oak decline incident on our hands here. So oak decline is kind of a combination of stresses that can take out a lot of trees over a large area. So in this case, it's spongy moth defoliation coupled with tree age, coupled with poor soils, coupled with drought. All those things kind of working together create these mosaics of dead trees across the forest. And this is what they kind of look like if you get under them. You'll notice the crowns of these are really, really small. Oak decline is a chronic issue. It happens over years. And so what happens is the tree starts dying back, like I talked about earlier, and that crown just gets smaller and smaller and closer into the trunk until the tree finally dies. But you can see like this one doesn't have a lot of fine branching structure left. The other thing with oak decline is you can have pockets like this. where there's a bunch of trees that all suddenly die, or you can have it kind of diffuse across the landscape like the last picture I showed. But yeah, because it's these kind of landscape level issues, right? Like soils are dry across the landscape, or spongy moth is defoliating hundreds of thousands of acres. It tends to be these larger sort of events. So, oh my gosh, how am I going to tell the difference between oak wilt and oak decline? It can be challenging, but I've made a table. I'm going to try to walk us through it. So oak wilt, it's a very, very quick disease. The symptoms appear in as little as 2 weeks, and the tree is dead in the same season. Versus oak decline is what we call more chronic. It's a really slow decline over time. The tree might give up and brown in a single season, but if you've been paying attention, you've noticed that something's been wrong for a while. With oak wilt, the leaves fall in July through September, versus with oak decline, the leaves shrivel up and usually tend to stay on the tree. There will be some that fall, but it's not that really sudden, serious leaf drop like oak wilt. With oak wilt, the leaves are brown, yes, but they usually have some amount of green on them. Versus with oak decline, the leaves are typically all brown, shriveled up, and they may or may not be spotted with these little black spots as well. Oak wilt, we hope, we cross our fingers and say it's usually just 1 or 2 trees, because it's beetles that are causing a lot of these infections. You know, you think about the chances of beetles visiting 1 wounded oak versus the chances of beetles visiting, 16 oaks that were all wounded at the same time that all have fungal spores. Usually whenever we find infection centers, it's just 1 or 2 trees. I believe the biggest infection center we've ever had was 9 trees. So it's not that same kind of mosaic like we saw with oak decline. So with oak decline, it'll be many larger oaks in an area. It's usually the larger oaks because those are the older oaks. And those are the ones that are not bouncing back from those stresses as well. With oak wilt, sometimes there's wounds visible. So there might be pruning wounds or spike wounds or where that guy hit the branch with his cab. It's not always visible because sometimes the wounds are way, way up in the branches from storm damage or whatever. But if I can walk up to an oak and see a wound, I always have oak wilt in the back of my mind. With oak decline, it's not wound associated, but sometimes you'll see other signs of stress that we talked about earlier. So you'll see those epicormic shoots, or sometimes you'll see insect damage in the trunk, or you'll see signs of root rot or signs of past dieback. And those can kind of help you put together what's happened. Oak wilt has that really rapid symptom development in red oaks in particular, versus oak decline has the same symptom development in all species. So if your white oak browns out in a single season, it's not oak wilt, it's more likely it's oak decline. And then oak wilt can happen anytime, versus oak decline happens 1 to maybe 5 years after spongy moth defoliation or some other big significant stress event. All right, so that's oak wilt and oak decline. And if you don't know, that's okay. The best way to know is to email foresthealth@dec.ny.gov. I have looked at both of these diseases for a long time. I've been working with oak wilt for 6 years now, and oak decline, I think, just as long. And I still get confused sometimes. I still get unsure sometimes. But the good news is, if I think it could be oak wilt, DEC will pay to sample your tree, which is great. And if I don't think it's oak wilt, then you know that I've had a lot of experience looking at these diseases, and you can feel reasonably sure that it's oak decline. So if you're not sure, just shoot me an email. All right, now we're going to talk about beech leaf disease. So I had somebody asking before we started about where beech leaf disease first showed up. It first showed up in Ohio, in that little county right there in 2011. And since then, it's done all of this. And so this is kind of the southmost extent. This county in Virginia was just found this past year. So that's why it hasn't really been as damaging super far south yet. Like I said, it just hasn't really gotten there yet. But throughout the Northeast, we've seen kind of largely this northern and eastern spread. It only just recently started moving south at all. And in New York, most of our counties are now infected. We only have 10 counties that don't have any signs of infection. What does infection look like? It causes these stripes on the underside of the leaves. These stripes are always between the veins. So you see them kind of line up nicely there. And these stripes are easiest to see in the summer by holding the leaves up to the light. It makes a nice kind of shadowing effect, and it's really easy to see them darkened against the lighter tissue. But you can also see them this time of year if you really want to. They are still there. You'll still see that kind of darkened tissue. It's just kind of harder to identify given that these leaves are drying out and getting beat up and getting snow on them and everything else and kind of degrading already. If it's really, really gnarly symptoms, if there's a lot of nematodes packed in there, you can sometimes get these, what we call shriveled leaves. These have like the texture of leather. They don't really feel like leaves at that point. And that's kind of the most severe symptom of this disease. These leaves tend to be kind of the first flush, and then the tree usually drops them because they're so energetically expensive. So usually by about June, most of these are dropped anyway. And this is the guy that the disease is associated with. This is Lydilinchus crenate mccannii. It's a nematode, which is a microscopic worm. And what he's doing is living inside of those darkened areas and feeding on the leaf tissue. And that feeding and kind of they think the proteins it produces and chemicals it produces causes essentially a gall, so a thickened area. And that's what makes that dark stripe. And so its nearest known relative is in Japan. So they think maybe that's where it came from, but there are researchers that are trying to figure out where exactly this disease came from. And these two pictures here in the center are the beech leaf disease that I found in Schenectady County. I found it this past year. We were at Sanders Preserve looking at oaks, actually, looking at oak decline. And as we were walking out, I just happened to glance at this one gall on this one tiny beech leaf. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's beech leaf disease. And we checked all the beech around there. I mean, we must have spent an hour looking for any other sign because I was joking that the diagnostician at Cornell was going to hate me if I sent her this one tiny leaf and asked her to confirm beech leaf disease for me. But we couldn't find anything else. This is all we found. So we did collect it. I sent it to Sandra. She's an angel. She confirmed beech leaf disease. And I kind of, I got to pat myself on the back for this one. This is the earliest I've ever found beech leaf disease. So we do plan to go back next year and survey this area further. And we're very, very interested in other reports of beech leaf disease from Schenectady County because it's pretty stinking new here. All right, so white pine needle damage is actually a native issue. It's a complex of 4 native fungi that just kind of seem to ramp into overdrive around 2016, maybe as early as 2012. And with this disease complex, what you tend to see is the white pines start yellowing and dropping their needles in the spring. Now, white pine can yellow and drop their needles in the fall. That's fine. That's normal. Pines actually drop their needles just kind of like Deciduous trees do, they just don't do it all at the same time. But if you're out in May and you're trying to ramp up for photosynthesis and get going for the spring, and you start yellowing and dropping all your needles, that's not a great thing for the tree. That's going to be really stressful. And so what you'll see is this yellowing throughout the canopy. You'll see needles all over the understory. Sometimes the trees look really, really thin. This past year was the worst that multiple cooperators of mine in the Northeast have seen since we started monitoring. There were trees in Massachusetts that were like 90% defoliated, which is crazy. I got reports from all across the state, Chautauqua County, up through Rensselaer County, down through Westchester County. It just seemed like it was really, really prevalent last year. And this disease is kind of encouraged by dry falls and wet springs. So we've had a really dry fall. And so if we have a wet spring, I anticipate we'll see a lot of this again. These two pictures are a couple of the fungi. Like I said, there's 4 native fungi, but this is Leucanisticta aceticola. And then this guy over here is Bifusella linearis. So if you look at these needles really closely, you might see those brown spots or this kind of black tarry looking stuff on them. And then this is kind of the new kid on the block. This is elm zigzag sawfly. And elm zigzag sawfly was first found in New York in 2022. And then we started surveying some more for it. And the more we survey for it, it seems like the more we find it. Other states have also started finding it. It's crazy. This thing can fly, I think, like 60 miles a year. So it has just crazy, crazy dispersal potential. And it's a sawfly, so it looks like a caterpillar, but to entomologists, it's not. This is what they look like if you get them up close under a microscope. But this is what you're going to see most commonly, and how it got its name is this kind of zigzag feeding pattern on elm leaves. And you can actually see there's one of the little guys right there, working on another zigzag. They always kind of bounce back and forth between the veins like this until it gets really, really severe, and there's just not enough leaf tissue left for them to eat. You may sometimes find these cocoons, these pupa. They make this kind of webby hammock for themselves, and then the pupa is actually this little brown guy right there. And then the adult is super tiny and just a black wasp, nondescript. And so, you know, I'm not expecting people to identify it from the wasp. Usually the reports we get are this zigzag feeding damage. And this was, this picture in the center is the most serious defoliation we've seen to date. And this was in Niskayuna. So this was a homeowner reported that all of her elm trees were getting defoliated. We confirmed elm zigzag sawfly. And I believe it's the species of elms that made it more susceptible in this case. Whatever species of elm she had is something that elm zigzag sawfly really, really liked. But usually whenever we see damage, it's just 1 or 2 of these little zigzaggy feeding trails. But if we do see defoliation like this, we're definitely interested in getting reports if you do happen to have elms in your area. And then the last guy is hopefully someone that everybody knows. This is hemlock woolly adelgid. I threw it in here because this is the best time to survey for hemlock woolly adelgid because they're nice and fluffy this time of year. They look like kind of Q-tip cotton fluff type guys right at the base of the needles along the twig. They're always along the twig, so if you see fluff on the needles, that's spider webs or other stuff. They're always here at the base. And they're pretty common throughout Schenectady County. We get people asking about how to manage this all the time. But if you happen to go pretty much anywhere north of Schenectady County and find it, we are interested in knowing. It's pretty new in the Adirondacks. We're still working to treat a lot of hemlocks in the Adirondacks. So if you see this as you go north, definitely let us know. And then this picture over here on the right is what they look like during the summer. These are the nymphs. So they just have a little halo of that waxy coating at that point. And it takes usually a hand lens and a headlamp to really see them at that point. So this is the best time to survey for HWA. And that's all I have. So do we have some more questions?
We do, yeah. Actually, if you stop the screen share, then everybody can see each other, and feel free to unmute yourself to raise hands or speak up. And until people speak up, we've got a few questions right here from Matt. He asked, what made it disappear? I'm assuming he's talking about oak wilt in Long Island. Lack of annual surveys to document it.
We tried, we looked, I promise. It just, I wish I knew. I wish I knew. I'd like to say that it was just we did such a good job of managing it, because oak wilt is a very, very manageable disease. The fungus fruits on those killed trees. So as long as you find a tree and cut it down and chip it or burn it or dispose of it before the following year, you can kind of break that cycle.
Do you
So
need
I
a
hope
perimeter around it of other trees?
you can. So we actually did in Long Island, just because of logistics and timing and that kind of stuff. And we've actually found that on other sites too. So in the Midwest, they have a lot of what's called root graft spread, which is oak wilt can move through junctions in the roots where roots of two trees come together and graft. We haven't really seen that in New York. We think that our forests are diverse enough and our soils are thin enough and rocky enough and mountainous enough that those root grafts just aren't really happening. So typically we just cut the infected tree and dispose of it at this point.
Okay. So then the next question here is, does beech leaf disease kill mature beech trees like beech bark disease, or do they kill off the sprouts and saplings?
Oh man. This is one of those I wish I knew questions about beech leaf disease. I will say we've been monitoring it since 2019, at 23 plots across the state. And I don't have an exact number, but I feel like it's in the thousands of trees that we look at every single year. And we've seen 16 trees die total so far across the state. That's not to say that some big stress event couldn't happen. What we think is going to happen with beech leaf disease is that it's just going to be another stress on beech along with beech bark disease and things like that. And so if we get, for example, a big drought, could we see just massive amounts of beech mortality? It's possible. But for right now, Ohio has said that it can kill mature trees. We have seen it kill mature trees whenever there were other things involved, like there was a root rot and beech bark disease and wood boring insects and beech leaf disease, and look, now it's dead. We haven't really seen trees killed outright from beech leaf disease yet.
Okay. So let me toss in mind before the next one about hemlock woolly adelgid. This is called hemlock woolly adelgid, but it's not specifically just on hemlocks, right? I mean, is it on like Colorado blue spruce and other? It's really only hemlock?
It's hemlock. Yep, that's what it sticks to. There is in its native range, again, pathologist trying to remember entomology things. In its native range, it has an alternate host that is a spruce.
Okay.
And so there's one generation that can fly and goes off to this spruce. But we don't have that spruce here, so that generation just dies here. So in North America, to my understanding, it is purely on hemlock.
Okay. And then the question written here is hemlock woolly adelgid and all the other pathogens can be marked on IMAP invasives, right?
Yeah, so the only one that I went over that can't be marked on IMAP invasives is that white pine needle damage, because I said that was a complex of 4 native fungi. So that's not invasive, that's not on IMAP invasives. But everybody else I talked about can be put on IMAP invasives.
Okay. Do some other people have some questions? Well, that was super interesting. Thank you so much, Kelsey. I really enjoyed that. Oh,
Yeah.
wait. I think something popped up here. Hang on. Oh, okay. Matt says, thank you so much for answering all the questions.
Oh yeah. And if people have more questions, just remember foresthealth@dec.ny.gov.
I
You
took some
can,
screenshots, so I'll even see if I can share those on our Facebook page and so
yeah,
forth.
totally.
So let me add real quick about next month. Next month, we actually have somebody speaking to us from Ireland. So he's going to speak 1 hour earlier. So he only has to do it at 11 p.m. his time. So everybody keep in mind 6 p.m. next month on February 20th. And other than that, this was really interesting. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
All right, everybody have a good night. And it will also be posted on our website, the recording of this, if anybody wants to see that, or if you want to show your mom, Kelsey, or anything else. Okay.
Thank you.
Have a good night.